There comes a time in every man's life when the world stops offering second chances. Wade Connelly knew that feeling well. 62 years old, flat broke, and watching younger men take the work that once kept him fed. When a desperate rancher offered him a worn-out donkey instead of cash payment, Wade could have walked away. But pride's expensive when your pockets are empty. What he didn't know was that this tired animal named Trotter carried secrets older than the valley itself, secrets that would lead him to hidden water, away from danger he couldn't see coming, and finally to an abandoned mine holding more than faded memories. But what was Trotter really protecting, and why had this loyal creature chosen Wade? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light came hard through the gap in Wade Connelly's curtains, the kind of light that doesn't care about a man's need for rest. He sat up on the edge of his bed, both hands pressing into his lower back, and waited for the familiar ache to settle into something manageable. 62 years of ranch work had left its mark, not just in the lines on his face or the grey in what was left of his hair, but in the way his knees protested every morning and his shoulders remembered every fence post he'd ever driven into hard ground. The cabin around him was small but tidy, the way a man keeps things when there's no one else to see the mess. One room for sleeping, one for living, a kitchen that was really just a corner with a stove and a sink that coughed when the water came through. His wife Martha would have hated it. She'd had dreams of a real house with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, maybe some flower boxes in the summer. But Martha had been gone 8 years now, and those dreams had been buried right alongside her up on the hill. Behind the church, Wade pulled on his jeans, the same pair he'd worn for the better part of 3 years, and reached for the flannel shirt hanging on the bedpost. His fingers worked the buttons slowly, giving his hands time to remember they still worked. On the small table near the window sat his wallet, and he picked it up more out of habit than hope. $2.37. Enough for coffee at Mrs. Chen's general store, maybe a can of beans if he was lucky. The electric bill sat unopened beneath it, and he didn't need to look inside to know it was past due. Through the window, he could see his land stretching out in that particular way the valley had of looking both beautiful and indifferent at the same time. 15 acres that weren't worth much without water rights, and the small barn that leaned a little more to the left every year. His truck sat near the fence line, but he hadn't driven it in 2 weeks, couldn't afford the gas. The saddle in the barn, though, that was different. 40 years old, worn in all the right places. The leather still supple because he'd never stopped caring for it. A man could lose everything else, but his saddle was his dignity. He made coffee in the pot that had belonged to his father, measured it out careful because the can was getting low. While it percolated, Wade looked at the photograph on the shelf above the sink. Martha smiled back at him, young and full of all that hope that life has a way of testing. Next to her stood a little girl with pigtails, maybe 6 years old, looking up at her mama like she hung the moon. That girl was 34 now, living in Denver, working some job in an office building Wade couldn't picture. They hadn't spoken in 2 years, not since the argument about him selling the land and moving to one of those assisted living places. "I'm 60, not 90, he'd told her on the phone, his voice harder than he'd meant it to be. "You're alone out there, Dad," she'd said back, and there was something in her tone that reminded him too much of Martha's disappointment. "What happens when you fall? When you get sick? Who's going to help you?" He hadn't had a good answer then, and he didn't have one now. So they'd stopped calling, and the silence between them had grown into something solid and unmovable. Like a fence, neither of them knew how to climb. Wade drank his coffee black and ate 2 pieces of toast with the last of the jam. Then he pulled on his boots, the good ones, because a man going to look for work needed to look like he could still do it, and walked the half-mile into town. The valley had changed in the years since the railroad pushed through. Used to be a place where a man could find work if he wasn't afraid of it, where the ranches needed hands and the cattle needed moving and the seasons dictated the rhythm of life. But the railroad had brought new money and new ways, and suddenly the old ranches were being bought up by corporations with managers who flew in from back east. They wanted younger men, stronger backs, people who could work the new machinery and didn't remember how things used to be done. Main Street looked the same as it always had, a row of brick buildings that had stood since before Wade was born. The general store, the bank, the post office, and Murphy's bar at the end, where the old-timers gathered to complain about progress. Mrs. Chen was sweeping the front step of her store when Wade passed, and she gave him the kind of nod that said she understood about pride and wouldn't mention the tab he was running. "Morning, Wade," she said, her accent still carrying traces of the Guangdong province she'd left 40 years ago. "Mrs. Chen," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. The employment office was in a converted storefront between the hardware store and what used to be a barber shop. Wade had been there 6 times in the last month, and each time the woman behind the desk, young enough to be his granddaughter, had given him the same sympathetic look and the same answer. "Nothing suitable. Maybe next week. We'll keep your name on file. Today was no different. I'm sorry, Mr. Connelly," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. The Morrison Ranch filled their positions yesterday. They were looking for someone with experience on the new automated feeding systems. "I can learn," Wade said, hearing the edge in his own voice. "I've been working ranches since before those systems were invented." I know," she said, and he could tell she did know, which somehow made it worse. "It's just that they want someone who already has the certification. Insurance requirements and all that." Wade nodded and turned to leave before she could offer more sympathy. He didn't need sympathy. He needed work. He spent the rest of the morning making the rounds he'd made 100 times before. The bank, where Thompson the manager gave him an extension on the loan payment but made it clear there wouldn't be another one. The feed store, where old Jimmy offered him 3 days' work stocking shelves for $20 a day. Wade took it, grateful, knowing it wouldn't be enough but that something was better than nothing. By noon, he was tired in a way that had less to do with his body than with his spirit. He sat on the bench outside the post office and watched the world move around him. Young families with children who'd never known a life without computers. Teenagers on their phones, living in some digital space he couldn't begin to understand. Trucks passing through with out-of-state plates, headed somewhere that wasn't here. He thought about calling his daughter, apologizing for being stubborn, asking if maybe they could talk, just talk, about nothing important. But pride stopped him, the same pride that had been stopping him from a lot of things lately. The afternoon found him walking the long road toward the Hendricks place, a small ranch 10 miles out that still operated the old way. He'd heard through Jimmy that Hendricks might need a hand with some fence repair, and Wade figured it was worth the walk, even if it turned out to be nothing. The sun was high and hot by the time he reached the ranch gate, and his shirt stuck to his back with sweat. Hendricks was in the yard, a man 10 years younger than Wade, but looking 20 years older, the weight of a failing operation clear in every movement. "Wade," Hendricks said, surprise in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you out here. Heard you might have some work," Wade said, keeping his voice level. "Fence repair or whatever else needs doing." Hendricks looked at the ground, then back at Wade, and in that moment, Wade knew. He'd seen that look before, the look of a man about to deliver bad news he didn't want to deliver. "I've got fence work," Hendricks said slowly, "but I can't pay in cash, Wade. I'm barely keeping the lights on as it is. Bank's breathing down my neck about the mortgage." Wade felt something sink in his chest, but kept his expression neutral. "What are you offering?" Hendricks walked toward the corral and Wade followed. Inside stood 3 horses and 1 donkey, all looking as tired as Wade felt. The donkey was gray, medium-sized, with long ears that drooped slightly, and eyes that seemed to carry their own kind of weariness. "His name's Trotter," Hendricks said. "Had him about 5 years. Good animal, never caused trouble. But I'm selling off what I can, and nobody wants a donkey. Not when they can have a horse or a mule." He turned to face Wade. 3 days' work on the fence line. "They'll give you Trotter and throw in 50 pounds of feed. I know it's not much, but it's what I've got." Wade looked at the donkey. Trotter looked back at him with what might have been the same resignation Wade saw in his own mirror every morning. A useless animal for a useless job, paid to a man the world had decided it didn't need anymore. Pride's expensive when your pockets are empty. All right, Wade said. I'll take it. They shook hands. And Wade spent the next 3 days in the sun, stretching wire and setting posts, his body reminding him constantly that this was young man's work, and he was no longer young. But he did it well, the way he'd done everything in his life, with care and attention and the quiet satisfaction of a job done right. On the third evening, Hendricks brought Trotter out on a lead rope along with 2 bags of feed and an old leather halter that had seen better days. He's a good animal, Hendricks said again, and there was genuine regret in his voice. Takes care of himself mostly. Not skittish. You won't have trouble with him. Wade took the rope and looked down at Trotter. Up close, he could see the grey in the donkey's muzzle, the way his coat had grown rough in places. They were both past their prime, both making do in a world that had moved on without asking permission. Come on then, Wade said quietly. Let's go home. The walk back took most of the evening, and Wade let Trotter set the pace. The donkey moved with a deliberate, unhurried gait, stopping occasionally to look at something Wade couldn't identify. A rock formation, a particular tree, the way the light fell across the valley floor. Wade didn't push him. There was something almost peaceful about it. This slow journey, with a creature who seemed to be in no hurry to get anywhere. By the time they reached Wade's property, the sun was setting behind the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Wade why he'd stayed in this valley despite everything. He led Trotter to the barn and opened the door to one of the empty stalls. There was old hay on the ground, and Wade spread some of the fresh feed in the corner. This is it, he said to the donkey. Not much, but it's what we've got. Trotter stepped into the barn, looked around, then turned and walked back out to stand in the yard. Wade frowned. Come on now. You need to be inside. But Trotter just stood there, looking at Wade with those dark, patient eyes, and wouldn't budge. Wade tried twice more, pulling gently on the lead, offering more feed, speaking in the calm voice he'd used with horses his whole life. Trotter remained in the yard. Stubborn thing, Wade muttered, though there was no real anger in it. He tied the lead to the fence post and left a bucket of water nearby. Suit yourself, then. Inside his cabin, Wade heated a can of soup and ate it with crackers that had gone soft in their box. He sat at his small table and looked at his wallet again. Still $2.37, minus what he'd spent on coffee and gas for the stove. The electric bill still sat there unopened. He'd have to call them tomorrow, see if they'd take a partial payment. Through the window, he could see Trotter standing in the yard, head low, looking for all the world like a creature carrying some burden Wade couldn't see. 2 useless things, Wade thought. Him and this donkey. Maybe that's all this world had left for either of them. Just marking time, until time decided it had marked enough. He washed his single dish and cup, dried them, put them away. Then he lay down on his bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling until sleep came to take him somewhere that didn't have bills or empty wallets, or daughters who'd stopped calling. Outside, Trotter stood watch beneath the stars, patient and knowing, waiting for the morning when everything would begin to change. Wade woke to the sound of movement outside his window. The first grey light of dawn was just starting to push back the darkness, and for a moment he lay still, listening. Hoofbeats, soft and deliberate, moving across the packed earth of his yard. He got up, wincing as his back reminded him of 3 days on fence lines, and looked out the window. Trotter had moved from where Wade had tied him the night before. The lead rope lay on the ground, still knotted to the fence post, but somehow worked free. The donkey now stood 30 feet away, near the corner of the property where the old split-rail fence marked the boundary with open grassland. How in the world did you manage that? Wade muttered, pulling on his boots. Outside, the morning air carried that particular chill that comes just before sunrise. Wade walked over to where Trotter stood, examining the freed lead rope. The knot hadn't been undone. The rope had simply slipped through. Not broken, not chewed. Just worked free as if the donkey had understood exactly what he needed to do. "You're smarter than you look," Wade said, reaching for the lead. But as he did, Trotter moved away, not running, just stepping aside with that same deliberate motion, and positioned himself even farther from the barn. Wade followed, and Trotter moved again. It happened 3 more times before Wade stopped, hands on his hips, studying the animal in the growing light. "What are you doing?" he asked, though he didn't expect an answer. Trotter stood perfectly still, looking back toward the barn and the section of fence he'd been tied near. Those long ears were forward, alert, and something in the donkey's posture made Wade turn and look at what Trotter was looking at. The fence line. The old fence line with posts that Wade had meant to replace but never found the time or money. Nothing looked different. Everything looked fine. "You're just being contrary," Wade decided, and went about his morning routine. He made coffee, ate a piece of toast, and tried not to look at the bills on his table. When he went back outside an hour later, Trotter had moved even farther from the barn, and now stood near the edge of Wade's property, looking back with what could only be described as insistence. "I don't have time for this," Wade told the donkey. He had to go into town, had to call the electric company, had to start his 3 days at the feed store. He needed to secure Trotter somewhere the animal wouldn't wander off. The barn was the logical choice, but when Wade tried to lead Trotter back, the donkey planted his hooves and wouldn't budge. Not with pulling, not with coaxing, not with an offered handful of feed. He just stood there, solid as the rocks that dotted the valley floor. Wade gave up after 20 minutes. He had more important things to worry about than a stubborn donkey. He left fresh water and feed near where Trotter stood, and walked into town muttering about the foolishness of accepting livestock as payment. He spent the morning stocking shelves at the feed store, his mind half on the work and half on the bills that needed paying. Jimmy paid him at the end of the day in cash, $20 that Wade folded carefully and put in his wallet. It helped, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. When he got home that evening, Trotter was in the same spot, still watching the barn, and the fence section the donkey had been tied to the night before had collapsed. Wade stood very still, looking at the fallen rails and the posts that lay on the ground like discarded matchsticks. The wood was rotted through in places he hadn't seen, weakened by years of weather and insects. If Trotter had still been tied there when it fell, the rope could have tangled, could have trapped him. A spooked animal could have broken a leg trying to get free. Wade walked over to the collapsed fence and ran his hand along one of the fallen posts. The wood crumbled under his fingers, soft and useless. He'd walked past this fence 100 times and never noticed how bad it had gotten. He turned and looked at Trotter, who looked back at him with those patient, knowing eyes. "You knew," Wade said quietly. "Somehow you knew." The donkey didn't move, didn't react, just stood there as if to say that yes, he'd known, and what of it? Wade went inside and sat at his table, staring at the wall. He wasn't a superstitious man. Never had been. He believed in work and weather and the way things were, not in signs or wonders. But that donkey had moved away from danger he couldn't possibly have known about, had freed himself from a knot without hands, had refused every attempt to go back. That night, Wade couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the valley, the wind moving through grass, the distant call of a night bird, the creaking of his cabin settling. And outside, the soft sound of Trotter moving around the yard, never straying far, never quite settling. Wade got up before dawn and made a decision. He'd planned to sell Trotter as soon as he could find a buyer. Had already asked around town about who might want a donkey. But now something had changed. Whatever was happening here, whatever this animal was doing, Wade needed to understand it. Not for money, not for any practical reason he could name, just because in 62 years of living he'd never seen anything quite like this. The next day he took Trotter into town with him. He needed supplies from Mrs. Chen's store, and the walk would do them both good. More than that, he wanted to see if the behavior would continue, if it was just a coincidence about the fence, or if there was something more. They took the main road, the one Wade had walked 1,000 times. Trotter moved at that same unhurried pace, stopping occasionally to look at things, and Wade let him. About halfway to town, at the place where the road forked, one path continuing straight, the other curving down to follow the creek, Trotter stopped completely and turned toward the creek path. "Not that way," Wade said, tugging gently on the lead. "Town straight ahead. Always has been," but Trotter wouldn't move forward. He stood firm, looking down the creek path, and no amount of coaxing would change his mind. Wade stood there for 5 minutes, feeling foolish, before finally giving in. "All right," he said. "We'll go your way. But if this makes us late, I'm turning you into glue." The creek path was longer and wound through a section of scrub oak that made the air cooler and dimmed the sunlight. Wade hadn't walked this way in years. There was no reason to. But Trotter moved with purpose now, his pace slightly quicker, his ears forward as if he knew exactly where he was going. They were halfway down the path when Wade heard it, the sound of wheels and hooves moving fast, too fast for the conditions. He stopped, listening, and then saw it through the trees. A wagon coming down the main road, the horses running wild, the driver fighting the reins. The wagon hit a rut and tilted, nearly overturned, kept going in a careening path that would have met Wade right at the fork if he'd been there. Wade watched it pass, his heart pounding in his chest. The wagon finally slowed half a mile down the road, the driver regaining control. If Wade had been on the main road at the fork, there would have been no time to get out of the way. No time to do anything but take the impact. He looked down at Trotter, who had stopped walking and now stood calmly, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to happen. "You knew," Wade said again, and this time his voice carried something between wonder and disbelief. "You knew that was coming." For the first time since accepting this animal as payment, Wade felt something shift inside him. The photograph of Martha and his daughter flashed through his mind. That image of connection, of trust, of the family he'd lost through his own stubbornness and pride. He reached into his pocket and touched the faded edges of that photo, always carried, rarely looked at. This donkey had just saved his life. Twice in 2 days, Trotter had known things he couldn't possibly know and had acted to prevent harm. And Wade, who had been sleepwalking through his own existence for the better part of 8 years, suddenly felt very awake. They continued into town, Wade's mind racing. He bought his supplies from Mrs. Chen, barely aware of what he was putting in the bag. His thoughts kept circling back to the same questions. How did Trotter know? What else did he know? And why had this animal chosen to show Wade, of all people, what he could do? That evening, back at his cabin, Wade made a decision. He went to the small desk in the corner and pulled out an old notebook he'd used years ago for tracking cattle movements. Most of the pages were empty, yellowed with age. He opened it to the first blank page and wrote at the top, "Trotter, observations." Beneath that, he documented everything. The fence, the wagon, the times and places, and exactly what had happened. He wasn't sure why he was doing it, wasn't sure what he hoped to find. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Wade Connelly felt like maybe he had a purpose beyond just surviving until the next day. Outside, Trotter stood in the yard, his grey coat silvered by moonlight, watching the darkness with patient, knowing eyes. And somewhere in the valley, hidden in the bones of the land itself, secrets waited that were older than memory and more valuable than gold. Wade spent the next 3 days watching Trotter with the careful attention of a man trying to solve a puzzle he didn't know existed. The donkey moved around the property with purpose, stopping at certain places, avoiding others. Small things Wade might have missed if he wasn't looking. How Trotter wouldn't walk near the well house until Wade checked it and found a crack in the foundation. How the animal seemed to know when the weather was about to turn. Moving to shelter hours before the first clouds appeared, Wade wrote it all down in his notebook, filling pages with observations that would have seemed crazy if he'd tried to explain them to anyone else. But he wasn't explaining them to anyone. This was between him and Trotter, and whatever strange knowledge the donkey carried. By the 4th day, Wade had run low on supplies and needed to make a trip across the basin to the feed and supply depot in Clearwater, a small settlement. 30 miles east, where prices were better than in town, and the owner didn't mind if a man's money was scarce. It was a full day's journey there and back, the kind of trip Wade used to make once a month, when he had steady work and a truck that ran reliably. He hadn't made the trip in 6 months, but his pantry was nearly empty, and Jimmy at the feed store had mentioned hearing about day work available in Clearwater. Worth the walk, Wade figured, worth the chance. As he packed his old rucksack with a canteen and some hardtack, Wade looked at Trotter standing in the yard and made a decision. "You want to come along?" he asked the donkey. "I could use the company, and you seem to know things about the road I don't." Trotter's ears perked forward, and Wade took that as a yes. They set out in the early morning when the air still held the night's coolness. Wade had walked this route countless times over the years, straight across the basin floor, following the old wagon road that ran parallel to the creek for the first 10 miles before cutting east toward the hills. It was straightforward, well-marked, no reason to deviate, except Trotter had other ideas. At the first fork, where the wagon road continued straight and a smaller trail split off to the north, Trotter stopped and turned toward the smaller trail. Wade looked down the main road, then at the donkey, then pulled out his notebook and wrote, "Mile marker 3, Trotter chooses North Trail. Reason unknown." "All right," Wade said. "We'll try it your way. But if we end up lost, I'm blaming you." The North Trail was older, less used, and wound through rockier terrain that made Wade's knees complain with every step. But Trotter moved with confidence, and Wade found himself trusting that confidence in a way he hadn't trusted much of anything lately. 2 hours in, the trail opened onto a section of ground Wade didn't recognize. A shallow depression surrounded by red rock formations that looked like they'd been carved by ancient water. And in the center of that depression, impossible and perfect, was a spring. Wade stopped so suddenly that Trotter had to halt and look back at him. The spring bubbled up from the ground, clear and steady, forming a small pool before trickling away into a channel that disappeared into the rocks. Wade approached slowly, knelt down, cupped his hand in the water. It was cold and clean, the kind of water that came from deep in the earth. He pulled out his old survey map, the one he'd carried for 40 years, and spread it on the ground. This area should have been dry according to the map. There were no springs marked here, no water sources at all. But the spring was real, had been real for who knew how long, and somehow Trotter had known it would be here. Wade filled his canteen, drank deeply, filled it again. Then he sat on a rock and looked at Trotter, who had moved to the edge of the pool and was drinking with unhurried calm. "How did you know?" Wade asked, not expecting an answer, just needing to voice the question. They rested there for an hour, and Wade added the spring to his notebook with as much detail as he could manage. Location, landmarks, the way the rocks formed a natural barrier that would hide it from casual travelers. This wasn't just luck, this was knowledge. When they continued, Wade let Trotter lead completely. Every choice, every turn, he followed where the donkey went, and Trotter led them on a path that took them through country Wade barely recognized, yet somehow felt ancient and purposeful. Late in the afternoon, they passed near an old line shack that Wade remembered from his younger days, a place where cowboys used to shelter during storms when they were working the far ranges. It was mostly collapsed now, one wall still standing, the roof long gone. Trotter didn't stop, but Wade noticed the animal's pace slow as they passed. Noticed how those long ears turned toward the ruin as if listening for something. Wade made a note. Old line shack. Trotter shows interest. He'd come back to this place, he decided. There might be something there worth seeing. They reached Clearwater as the sun was lowering toward the western ridge. Wade had made good time despite the roundabout route, and his knees felt better than they had any right to after 30 miles. Something about following Trotter's path had been easier on his body, though he couldn't explain why. At the supply depot, Wade bought beans and flour and coffee with most of his remaining money. The owner, a man named Garrett with a beard that reached his chest, mentioned the day work was already filled. "Sorry, Wade," Garrett said. "Young fellow came through yesterday, took the whole week." Wade nodded, tried not to let the disappointment show. That's all right. Work'll come around. Outside, he fed Trotter some oats he'd bought and sat on the depot's front step, wondering if he should head back tonight or wait until morning. The return journey would put them home well after dark, and walking by moonlight was a young man's game. An old man's voice interrupted his thoughts. "That your donkey?" Wade looked up to see an ancient fellow with a face like weathered leather and eyes that were still sharp despite their age. He walked with a cane but moved with surprising steadiness. "Name's Ezra Polk," the old man said. "Mind if I sit?" "Wade, Connelly," Wade replied, gesturing to the step beside him. "Sit as long as you like." Ezra settled down with a satisfied sigh and looked at Trotter, who was finishing his oats with deliberate care. "Had me a donkey look just like that once," Ezra said. "Long time ago, back when I was working the mining claims up in the hills. Smart animal. Do smart for his own good sometimes." Wade felt something prick at his attention. "What do you mean, too smart?" "Oh, you know how animals get sometimes," Ezra said, pulling out a pipe and packing it with tobacco. "Some of them just seem to know things. This donkey I had, he'd lead me to water when I couldn't find it myself. Kept me from walking into a mine shaft that had collapsed during a tremor. Acted like he could read the land like you or I read a newspaper." Wade's heart beat faster. "That common around here? Animals like that?" Ezra lit his pipe and puffed thoughtfully. "Back in the old days, during the mining boom, there were stories. Trainers who bred animals special for the work, donkeys and mules mostly, claimed they could teach them to sense danger, to remember routes, to find things underground that men couldn't see. Most folks thought it was just tall tales. But I worked those mines for 20 years, and I'll tell you what, I saw things that made me wonder. What happened to your donkey?" Wade asked. "Sold him to another prospector when I left the mining life," Ezra said. "Fellow swore that donkey led him to a vein of silver nobody else could find. Last I heard, he'd made enough to retire comfortable." He glanced at Trotter. "That one's got the same look about him, patient, like he's waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" Ezra shrugged. "That's between him and whatever he knows. But I'll tell you this, if I were you, I'd pay attention to where he leads you. Those old mining trails are still out there, and some of them connect to things that got lost when the boom ended." He paused, took a long draw on his pipe. "You ever hear about the Confederate gold?" Wade had heard the legend, same as everyone who'd lived in the valley. Story went that a Confederate supply train had been moving gold west during the war, trying to keep it from Union forces. The train had disappeared somewhere in the basin, and the gold with it. People had been looking for it off and on for 60 years, never finding more than rumors. "Don't tell me you believe that story," Wade said. "Don't believe, don't disbelieve," Ezra replied. "But I'll say this, the Confederates did move through here, that's documented. And they did use animals that knew the land to guide them through hostile territory. Smart animals. Animals bred to remember routes and find resources." He looked at Trotter again. "Animals like that one there." Wade felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "You think Trotter's connected to that?" "I think that donkey knows something," Ezra said. "What it is, I couldn't tell you. But if I were a betting man, which I used to be, much to my wife's dismay, I'd bet he didn't show up in your life by accident." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun paint the hills in shades of gold and orange. Finally Ezra stood, his joints creaking in sympathy with Wade's own aches. "Best get home before full dark," the old man said. "But Wade, be careful. There's folks who still look for that gold. And if they think you're onto something, they won't be friendly about it." Wade thanked him and watched Ezra walk away into the gathering dusk. Then he looked at Trotter, who had finished his oats, and now stood waiting with that same patient expression. "You know about the gold?" Wade asked quietly. "Is that what you're trying to show me?" Trotter just looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes, and Wade knew he wouldn't get an answer, not in words anyway. The answer would come the same way everything else had, in the paths Trotter chose, in the places he led, in the knowledge he carried without speaking. They started home as the first stars appeared, and when Trotter led them down a completely different route than they'd used coming out, a route that seemed to follow the contour of the land in ways Wade's old map didn't show, he didn't argue. He just followed, taking notes in his mind, and wondered what other secrets this valley held. They reached home 3 hours after dark, and Wade was grateful when his cabin came into view beneath a moon that lit the valley in silver. His legs ached in that deep way that promised they'd complain louder come morning, but there was something else, a feeling of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. The walk had been long but not empty. Every mile with Trotter had felt like it meant something. The next morning, Wade woke with the sunrise and found Trotter standing near the eastern fence line, pawing at the ground. Not random pawing, but focused, deliberate movements in the same spot, as if the donkey was trying to tell him something. Wade pulled on his boots and walked over, coffee cup still in hand. The spot where Trotter was digging was nothing special, just dirt and scrub grass, like everywhere else on his property. But Trotter persisted, and Wade had learned not to ignore the animal's insistence. "What is it?" Wade asked, setting down his coffee. "What are you showing me?" Trotter stepped back, and Wade knelt down in the disturbed earth. He brushed away loose dirt with his hand, feeling foolish, like a child looking for buried treasure. His fingers hit something solid and metallic. He dug more carefully, working around the object until he could lift it free. It was a compass, old brass, tarnished but still intact, with a hinged cover that opened to reveal the face beneath. The needle still swung free, pointing north with patient accuracy. On the back of the case, someone had engraved initials, JTM. Below that, a date, 1863. Wade sat back on his heels, holding the compass in both hands. It was heavy, well-made, the kind of instrument that would have been expensive when it was new. And it was old, 62 years old, buried in his property for who knew how long. He looked at Trotter, who stood watching him with that expression of patient knowing. "You knew this was here," Wade said. "How could you possibly know?" There was no answer, just the sound of wind moving through grass and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Wade pocketed the compass and went inside to add this discovery to his notebook. But even as he wrote, his mind was racing ahead. JTM 1863. Those initials had to mean something. That date put the compass right in the middle of the Civil War, right in the time frame of the Confederate gold legend. After his morning chores, Wade walked into town, the compass heavy in his pocket. He went straight to the library, a small building attached to the back of the town hall where Miss Albright presided over a collection of books and local records that went back to the valley's founding. Miss Albright was in her 70s, sharp as the tacks she used to pin notices to her bulletin board, with white hair pulled back in a bun and reading glasses that hung on a chain around her neck. She looked up when Wade entered, surprise crossing her face. "Wade Connelly," she said. "I don't think I've seen you in here in 10 years. Been that long?" Wade replied, feeling embarrassed. "I need to look at some old records. Civil War era, if you have them." Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't ask questions. She just led him to a back room, where file boxes lined metal shelves. "What exactly are you looking for?" Wade pulled out the compass and showed her. "Found this on my property. I want to know who JTM was." Miss Albright took the compass carefully, turned it over in her hands, studied the engravings. Her expression changed from curiosity to focused interest. "This is quite a find," she said quietly. "Do you know what you have here?" "Old compass," Wade said. "Thought maybe it belonged to someone local." "It did," Miss Albright replied. "Or at least someone who passed through here." She handed back the compass and began pulling boxes from the shelves. "JTM most likely stands for James Thomas Mitchell. He was a Confederate captain assigned to supply transport through this region. There are records, not many but some, that mention his name in connection with movements through the basin in 1863. Wade felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of supplies?" "The records aren't specific," she said, spreading papers on a reading table. "But there's been speculation for years that Mitchell was involved in moving valuables west, trying to keep them out of Union hands. His unit disappeared in the summer of 1863. No bodies were ever found, no official report of what happened. Just gone." She pulled out a faded map, carefully unfolded it on the table. "This is a reproduction of a survey map from that period. See here?" She pointed to a section that covered the basin and surrounding hills. This area was contested territory. Neither side held it firmly, which made it useful for covert movements. Wade studied the map, comparing it mentally to the terrain he knew. If Mitchell was moving through here with valuables, where would he have gone? That's the question people have been asking for 60 years, Miss Albright said. The legend says he had gold. The reality is probably less romantic, maybe payroll, maybe personal effects of officers. But whatever it was valuable enough that his disappearance spawned treasure hunters for generations. She looked at Wade with keen interest. Where exactly did you find this compass? On my property, Wade said, being deliberately vague. Just happened to turn it up. Miss Albright studied him for a long moment, and Wade had the sense she knew he wasn't telling her everything. But she just nodded and began making copies of the relevant documents on her old photocopy machine. Take these, she said, handing him the copies. If you find anything else, I'd appreciate knowing about it. This is local history, Wade. It belongs to all of us. Wade promised he would and left with a folder full of papers he'd study later. But as he walked home, his mind kept circling back to the same thought. Trotter had led him to that compass, had known exactly where it was buried, which meant the donkey knew things about this land that went back more than 60 years. He was halfway home when he stopped at the post office and found a letter waiting for him. His daughter's handwriting on the envelope. Wade's hands shook slightly as he opened it. The letter was short. She was getting married in 3 weeks. Just wanted him to know. No invitation, no request for him to be there. Just information. Delivered with the same careful distance they'd maintained for 2 years. Wade read it twice, standing there on the post office steps, then folded it carefully and put it in his pocket next to the compass. 2 pieces of metal, one from the past, one from the present, both carrying weight he wasn't sure how to handle. That evening he sat at his table and tried to write a response. Started 6 different times, crossed out words that felt wrong, stared at the blank page until his eyes hurt. What could he say? Congratulations felt hollow. I'm sorry for being stubborn felt too little too late. I wish I could be there felt like a lie when she hadn't invited him. Finally, he just wrote, I'm happy for you. I hope he's good to you. Your mother would have loved this. He signed it and sealed it before he could change his mind. Then he opened his notebook and wrote about the compass, about what Miss Albright had told him, about the way Trotter had known exactly where to dig. He wrote until his hand cramped and the candle on his table had burned down to a stub. Outside, Trotter stood in the yard, and Wade went to join him. The night was clear. Stars spread across the sky in numbers that made a man feel small. Wade leaned against the fence and looked at the donkey. My daughter's getting married, he said out loud. I wasn't a good father. Too focused on work, on keeping things going. By the time I looked up, she'd grown up and moved away, and I'd missed it all. He paused. Martha tried to tell me. Said I was spending so much time securing our future that I was missing our present. She was right. She was always right about those things. Trotter shifted his weight, ears moving slightly, and Wade took it as permission to continue. Now I've got this compass, and these records, and you showing me things I don't understand. And I can't help but think maybe it's not about treasure at all. Maybe it's about paying attention this time. About not missing what's right in front of me because I'm too stubborn or proud or scared to see it. He pulled out the photograph he always carried. Martha and his daughter. Both smiling, both gone in different ways. I can't get that time back, Wade said quietly. But maybe I can do something right this time. Maybe I can follow where you lead and trust that there's a reason for it. Trotter looked at him with those patient eyes, and Wade felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, but a kind of acceptance. This journey they were on, whatever it was his second chance. Not to find gold, but to find something worth more than metal and stone. The next morning, Wade mailed his letter to his daughter and began preparing for a longer expedition. If Trotter wanted to show him something, he'd follow. Not for riches, but for understanding. Not for himself, but for the chance to become the kind of man who deserved a second chance. He loaded his rucksack with supplies, packed his notebook and the copies from Miss Albright, and looked at the donkey who'd changed everything. All right, he said. Show me what you know, And Trotter, as if he'd been waiting for exactly those words, turned and headed toward the basin, towards secrets buried deeper than compasses and older than regret. The basin stretched out before them like a vast palm cupping the sky, and Wade followed Trotter deeper into country he hadn't visited in decades. They'd been traveling for 3 days, camping at night under stars that felt close enough to touch, and with each mile, Wade felt the modern world falling away behind them. Trotter led them along paths that weren't on any map Wade carried. Sometimes they were obvious, old game trails or traces of wagon roads from the mining days. Other times they were barely visible, just a subtle difference in the way grass grew or rocks lay that suggested passage. But Trotter never hesitated, moving with the confidence of someone following a map written in instinct rather than paper. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they came to an old line shack tucked into a fold of hills where 2 ridges met. Wade recognized it from his earlier trip to Clearwater, the collapsed building Trotter had shown interest in. Up close, it was in worse shape than Wade had thought. 3 walls still stood, but the roof was completely gone, and the door hung at an angle from one rusted hinge. Trotter stopped in front of the shack and stood very still, ears forward, focused on the ruin with an intensity Wade had learned to recognize. This was important. This was something he needed to see. Wade approached carefully, mindful of rotted floorboards and unstable walls. The interior was filled with years of debris. Tumbleweeds, branches blown in by wind, the remains of what might have been furniture once. He pushed through it carefully, testing each step, not sure what he was looking for, but trusting Trotter's judgment. In the back corner, beneath a collapsed section of wall, Wade found an old footlocker. It was locked and rusted, but the wood had rotted enough that the corner gave way when he pried at it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly disintegrated, was a leather-bound book. Wade lifted it out carefully. The leather was stiff and water-damaged, but the book was intact. He carried it outside into better light and opened it with hands that trembled slightly. It was a journal, the handwriting cramped and faded but still readable. The first entry was dated July 1863, and the name at the top of the page made Wade's breath catch, James T. Mitchell. He sat down on a rock and began reading, Trotter standing nearby as if standing guard. The entries were sparse, written by someone who was recording facts rather than feelings. Movement schedules, coordinates, weather conditions. But scattered throughout were references that made Wade lean forward with interest. The faithful beast continues to prove invaluable. One entry read, Where maps fail and memory falters, his instinct guides true. Santiago believes the line carries memory through blood, that what the sire knows, the offspring inherits. I thought him fanciful, but evidence suggests otherwise. Wade flipped through more pages, finding similar references. Reached waypoint 3 using the beast's guidance. No human could have found this spring without prior knowledge, yet he led us directly to it. And then, near what appeared to be the last entries, the burden grows heavy. Should I fall, I trust the keeper's line will remember. The faithful beast knows the path. What cannot be spoken can be shown. The journal ended abruptly, mid-entry, as if Mitchell had been interrupted and never returned to finish. But tucked into the back pages, Wade found something else, a piece of paper less damaged than the rest. With what looked like coordinates and rough sketches of landmarks, Wade compared them to his map, trying to match the drawings to terrain features. Some he recognized, the double-peaked hill to the north, the rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant. But others were mysteries, and the coordinates didn't match any system he knew. He was so absorbed in studying the journal that he didn't hear the horses until they were close. Trotter's ears went back, and that was Wade's only warning before 3 riders appeared over the rise to the east. Wade closed the journal quickly and stood, trying to look casual, like a man just resting on his journey. But his hands stayed near his belt, where he'd tucked the book inside his shirt. The riders pulled up 20 feet away. The leader was a man in his 40s with hard eyes and a face that suggested he wasn't interested in friendly conversation. His companions were younger, harder, the kind who made their living in ways that didn't bear close examination. "Afternoon," the leader said, his voice flat. "Long way out here for a man your age." "Could say the same about anyone," Wade replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Just passing through to where?" The man's eyes moved to Trotter, then back to Wade. "Awful empty country for casual traveling." "My business," Wade said simply. The leader smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Funny thing, we've been watching this area for a few weeks. Mining claims to check, you understand. And we've noticed you making some interesting trips. Stops at odd places, digging around old ruins." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Makes a man wonder what you're looking for." Wade felt his heart rate increase, but kept his expression calm. "Not looking for anything. Just an old man with a donkey taking the long way home. That's so." The man glanced at his companions. "See, I think you're lying. I think you found something, or you're close to finding something, and I'd like to know what that is." "Then you'll be disappointed," Wade said. "There's nothing here but old buildings and older memories." The tension stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Wade measured the distance to Trotter, calculated how fast he could move with his bad knees, estimated how much of a head start he'd need. Then one of the other riders spoke up. "Virgil, there's people coming up the valley trail." The leader, Virgil, looked past Wade and cursed under his breath. A moment later, Wade heard it too. Voices, the sound of horses getting closer. A ranching family by the sound of it, probably heading to check line fences. Virgil straightened in his saddle, his expression hardening. "This isn't over, old man. If you're smart, you'll head home and forget about whatever it is you think you're going to find out here. Appreciate the advice," Wade said evenly. Virgil and his men turned their horses and rode off to the west, disappearing over the ridge before the other group came into view. Wade stood very still, waiting until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline catching up with him. Trotter moved closer, and Wade put a hand on the donkey's neck, taking comfort in the solid warmth of the animal. "That was close," he said quietly. "Too close." The ranching family passed by shortly after, a father and two teenage sons checking fences like Wade had guessed. They waved, friendly, and Wade waved back, and they continued on their way with no idea of what had just happened. Wade waited until they were out of sight, then pulled out the journal and studied it again. If men like Virgil were watching this area, searching for something, then what Mitchell had hidden was more valuable than Wade had thought. Or at least valuable enough that dangerous people were interested. He should probably turn back. Take the journal to Miss Albright. Let the historians handle it. Stay out of whatever trouble was brewing. That would be the smart thing to do. But Wade looked at Trotter, who was watching him with those patient, knowing eyes, and he thought about the journal entries. The faithful beast knows the path. This wasn't about treasure for Trotter. It was about purpose. About completing something that had been left unfinished 60 years ago. And Wade had spent too many years leaving things unfinished himself. That night, he camped in a sheltered canyon and read the journal by firelight. Each entry painted a picture of a man trying to do something important in impossible circumstances. Mitchell had been moving something valuable, yes, but he'd also been trying to preserve something. Some kind of knowledge or resource that he believed mattered more than the war, more than whatever side he'd fought for. "What cannot be spoken can be shown," Wade read again, and looked at Trotter resting nearby. The donkey was part of a line, a keeper's line that carried memory through generations. Mitchell hadn't been transporting gold. He'd been protecting something else entirely. Something alive, something that could remember and guide and show future generations where to find what had been hidden. Wade added new entries to his own notebook, documenting everything he'd learned, drawing connections between Mitchell's words and Trotter's actions. Somewhere in this valley there was something worth finding, and whether it was gold or something else entirely, Wade was beginning to understand that the journey itself was changing him in ways that had nothing to do with treasure. He thought about his daughter, getting married in a few weeks without him there, thought about all the moments he'd missed because he'd been too focused on practical matters to see what was right in front of him. This time he wouldn't miss it. This time he'd follow where Trotter led, pay attention to what the donkey was trying to show him, and trust that there was meaning in the path even if he couldn't see the destination yet. The fire burned down to coals, and Wade wrapped himself in his bedroll, the journal tucked safely beside him. Above, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent and eternal, and somewhere in the darkness, other men plotted and schemed for treasure they didn't understand. But Wade slept peacefully, Trotter standing watch nearby, both of them part of something larger than themselves, following a path laid down by men and animals who'd understood that some things were worth more than gold. The foothills rose before them like the first breath before a climb, and Wade felt his age in every step. They'd been traveling for a week now, camping rough and living on the supplies Wade had brought, plus what they could find. Clear water from springs Trotter always seemed to locate, and the hardtack and jerky Wade had packed. His body protested this treatment with increasing volume, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in years. They reached the old mining district on a grey afternoon when clouds hung low and promised rain. Wade remembered this area from his 20s, when he'd worked as a ranch hand for the Morrison outfit, and they'd driven cattle through these hills. Back then, the mines had still showed signs of recent use, equipment left behind, buildings with roofs intact, the marks of human passage fresh enough to feel recent. Now, 40 years later, the district was a ghost of itself. Buildings had collapsed into piles of weathered wood. Mine entrances gaped like open mouths, some collapsed, some still showing the dark. Hollow where men had dug into the earth looking for silver and copper and whatever else. The mountain held Trotter moved through this landscape with the same purposeful confidence he'd shown throughout their journey. He passed by most of the mine entrances without pause, occasionally stopping to look at one before moving on, as if checking items off a list only he could see. At the fourth mine entrance, Trotter stopped and stayed stopped. Wade approached carefully. The entrance was partially collapsed, but a gap remained large enough for a man to squeeze through. Wooden beams still held up the opening, though they looked none too stable. "You want me to go in there?" Wade asked the donkey. Trotter just looked at him, patient and expectant. Wade sighed and pulled out the flashlight he'd brought. "If this kills me, you're explaining it to my daughter." He squeezed through the gap, mindful of his shoulders and the pack he wore. Inside, the mine shaft extended back into darkness, the walls showing chisel marks and the systematic excavation of men who'd been looking for ore. The air was cool and smelled of damp rock and earth. Wade moved slowly, testing each step, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. About 30 feet in, he found what Trotter had somehow known would be there. A brass button lay in the dirt, catching the light. Wade knelt and picked it up carefully. It was military issue. That much was clear even to his untrained eye. And when he rubbed away the dirt, he could see the eagle and shield design, the mark of a Confederate officer. Wade sat back against the mine wall, holding the button in his palm. Captain Mitchell had been here. 60 years ago, he'd passed through this mine, probably using it for shelter or as a waypoint on whatever journey he'd been making. And somehow, impossibly, Trotter had known. He searched the rest of the mine entrance carefully, looking for anything else Mitchell might have left behind. But there was nothing, just the button, small and solid, and confirming everything Wade had been piecing together from the journal. Outside, the rain had started, a light drizzle that promised to get heavier. Wade found shelter under an overhang of rock and made camp, Trotter standing nearby as if completely unbothered by the weather. Wade studied his maps and the journal by the light of a small fire he'd built. The coordinates from Mitchell's notes, the waypoints marked, the references to the keeper's line, it was all starting to form a pattern. Mitchell hadn't been trying to hide treasure in one place. He'd been creating a route, a series of locations that only someone with a guide, someone like Trotter, could follow. But why? What was at the end of this trail that was worth such elaborate secrecy? The rain intensified, and Wade pulled his oilcloth around his shoulders. He thought about home, about his small cabin that would be dry and warm if he were there. Thought about the easy path of giving up this search and returning to the life he knew. His hand went to his pocket, to the photograph he always carried. Martha and their daughter, frozen in a moment of happiness. He'd taken that photo 30 years ago on a Sunday afternoon when work had been light and the weather perfect. One of the few times he'd put down his tools and just spent time with his family. Should have done that more often, he said to the rain, to the memory, to himself. Should have put you first instead of always putting work first. Maybe then you wouldn't have left for Denver and never looked back. He pulled out his satellite phone, one of the few concessions to modern technology he'd made for this trip, and stared at it for a long time. His daughter's number was programmed in. He could call her, try to apologize, try to explain that he was changing, that he was learning what really mattered before he could talk himself out of it. He pressed the button. It rang 4 times and Wade was about to hang up when she answered. "Dad?" Her voice hit him like a physical thing, and for a moment he couldn't speak. "Dad, is everything okay?" More concerned now, and he realized she probably thought something was wrong for him to be calling after 2 years of silence. "I'm fine," Wade managed. "I just got your letter. About the wedding." Silence on the other end, and Wade could picture her face, the way she'd inherited Martha's expression of patient waiting when she was deciding how to respond to something difficult. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you for calling. I wanted to tell you I'm happy for you," Wade pressed on. "Your mother would have been so excited. She always wanted," his voice caught. "She always wanted you to find someone good." "Thanks, Dad." Her tone was polite, distant, the voice she probably used with clients at her office job. "That means a lot." Wade tried to find the words he'd practiced in his head. The apology, the admission of failure, the request for a chance to be part of her life again. But they all tangled up in his throat, and what came out instead was, "I've been doing some traveling. Out in the basin, about some interesting things." More silence, and he could feel her pulling back, retreating into the safe distance they'd established. "That's good, Dad. I hope you're being safe." "I am. I've got a donkey with me. Trotter, smart animal. Smarter than me, probably." He was babbling now, filling the silence with words that didn't matter because he couldn't find the ones that did. "Okay. Well, I need to go. I've got plans tonight." "Right, of course." Wade swallowed hard. "Your invitation, the wedding invitation. Did it get lost in the mail, or—" "Dad." Her voice was firm now, and he heard Martha in it, that tone that said, "We're not doing this." "I don't think it's a good idea. Not with how things have been between us." "I could try to do better," Wade said, and hated how it sounded. Like begging, like pleading. Like a man who'd realized too late what he'd lost. "You've said that before." No anger in her voice, just tired resignation. "Look, I really do need to go." "Thanks for calling. Be safe out there." The line went dead and Wade sat staring at the phone in his hand. "Be safe out there." As if he were a stranger who'd called to wish her well. Not her father, who'd held her when she was born and taught her to ride a bike and failed her in all the ways that really mattered. He put the phone away and sat in the rain, letting it soak through his oilcloth, not caring. Trotter moved closer, pressed his warm bulk against Wade's side, and Wade put his hand on the donkey's neck. "I deserved that," he said quietly. "Deserved worse, probably. But it doesn't make it hurt less." The rain fell harder, and Wade let it fall, let it wash over him while he sat with the pain of consequences that had been decades in the making. He'd spent his life prioritizing the wrong things, and now he was an old man, sitting in the rain with a donkey for company, chasing ghosts and secrets while his daughter got married without him. Eventually, the rain eased, and Wade made himself eat something even though he wasn't hungry. He checked on Trotter, made sure the donkey had water and shelter. Then he lay in his bedroll and stared at the rock ceiling above him. Tomorrow, they'd continue. Not because he thought he'd find treasure, but because stopping meant going home to emptiness, and at least out here, the emptiness had purpose. At least with Trotter, Wade was part of something that meant something, even if he didn't fully understand what that something was. He fell asleep thinking about his daughter's wedding, imagining the ceremony he wouldn't see, the father-daughter dance that would never happen, the grandchildren he might never know. And in his dreams, he saw Mitchell writing his journal by candlelight. Another man trying to leave something behind that would outlast his failures, hoping that someone would find it and understand that he'd tried his best in impossible circumstances. Morning came with clear skies, and Wade woke with resolve hardened by loss. He couldn't fix his relationship with his daughter. Not now, maybe not ever, but he could follow this path to its end. Could complete what Mitchell had started. Could prove to himself, if no one else, that he was capable of seeing something through to completion. He showed Trotter the button he'd found. "Captain Mitchell was here," Wade said. "And wherever he went next, that's where we're going. Whatever he was protecting, whatever you're supposed to show me, I'm ready to see it." Trotter looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes, and Wade felt something pass between them, understanding, perhaps, or recognition. Then the donkey turned and headed deeper into the mining district, towards secrets that had waited 6 decades for someone worthy of finding them. Wade followed, his daughter's rejection still fresh in his heart, but his purpose clearer than it had been in years. This was his second chance, not to fix what was broken, but to become the kind of man who deserved another chance, if one ever came. Trotter led Wade to a mine entrance. Wade would have passed without a second glance. It was smaller than the others, partially hidden by brush that had grown across the opening over decades. But when Wade pushed the brush aside, he saw that the entrance was more intact than it appeared, the wooden supports still solid, the darkness beyond still accessible. "This one?" Wade asked, though he knew the answer. Trotter stood very still, ears forward, focused on that dark opening with an intensity that made Wade's pulse quicken. He checked his flashlight, made sure his pack was secure, and squeezed through the entrance. Inside, the mine shaft was narrow, cut into the rock at a downward angle. Wade moved carefully, one hand on the wall, feeling his way through passages that turned and twisted in ways that suggested this mine had been following a vein rather than cut in a straight line. 50 feet in, the passage opened into a small chamber. Wade swept his flashlight around and caught his breath. Someone had used this space deliberately. There was a flat rock that served as a table, a cleared area where a bedroll might have lain, and marks on the wall that looked like they'd been made by a human hand. But what caught Wade's attention was the metal box wedged into a crevice in the back wall. It was sealed with wax, wrapped in oilcloth that had survived better than the cloth around Mitchell's journal, and when Wade pulled it free, the weight of it spoke of something important inside. He sat down on the ground and examined the box carefully. The seal was still intact, the wax unbroken. Whatever Mitchell had placed inside had been here, untouched, for 60 years. Wade broke the seal and opened the box. Inside was another journal, thicker than the first, bound in leather that had been treated with oil to protect it. Beneath the journal were rolled documents, brittle with age, but preserved by the sealed container. And at the very bottom, wrapped in cloth, were daguerreotype photographs showing men and animals, groups posed formally. An image showing a donkey standing beside a man in uniform. Wade lifted out the journal first and opened it to the first page. Mitchell's handwriting again, but this time the entries were different. More personal, more detailed, written not as operational notes, but as a record meant for someone to find. "To whoever reads this," the first entry began, "know that what follows is truth, though it may seem fantastic. I write this in the hope that the knowledge preserved here will survive beyond my own life, and that the line of keepers will continue their purpose." Wade read on, his hands trembling slightly. Mitchell explained how he'd been assigned to transport something valuable west, but not gold, not payroll. Something far more precious in the long term, documents establishing water rights, deeds to land, and records of underground springs and water sources throughout the basin and surrounding territories. "Water is life," Mitchell had written. "Gold can be spent and lost, but control of water in this arid land means survival for generations." The Union and Confederate forces both understood this, and both sought to control these resources. My mission was not to enrich the Confederacy, but to preserve these rights and resources so they could be claimed by whoever survived the war to build a lasting community. But Mitchell had faced a problem. The documents were too important to hide in one location, and the territory was too dangerous to cross openly. So he'd created a system, a series of waypoints, each one marked and documented, that would lead to the main cache where the most important documents were hidden, and to ensure the route could be found even if he died. He'd relied on the keeper's line. Wade turned pages, reading faster now, understanding dawning like sunrise. Mitchell described how he'd learned from a Mexican courier named Santiago about a tradition of breeding and training animals to serve as guides, not through maps or human teaching, but through inherited memory. Santiago had explained that certain bloodlines of donkeys and mules could pass knowledge from parent to offspring, not through words or training, but through instinct refined over generations. Santiago's people have bred these animals for centuries, Mitchell wrote. Each generation carries the memories of the previous, encoded somehow in their very nature. A donkey raised by parents who knew a route will know that route themselves, though they have never traveled it. They sense water where maps show none. They avoid danger that has not yet appeared. They remember. Mitchell had acquired 3 such animals from Santiago, each one descended from a line that had guided travelers through dangerous territory for over 100 years. He'd used them to establish his waypoint system, trusting that if he failed to complete his mission, the animals or their descendants would remember the route. The faithful beast is more than a mount or pack animal, Mitchell had written. He is a keeper of knowledge, a living map, a guide whose memory extends beyond a single lifetime. Should I fall, the line continues. Should the line continue, the knowledge survives. Wade set down the journal and looked at the documents. They were land deeds, water rights certificates, survey maps showing underground springs and aquifers, all dated between 1860 and 1863. All establishing ownership or access to water sources throughout the valley and basin. He spread them out carefully, afraid they might crumble at his touch. The surveyor's map alone was extraordinary. It showed water sources that weren't on any modern map, springs and underground streams that would be worth a fortune today when water was becoming increasingly precious and contested. The railroad, Wade realized with sudden clarity. The railroad that had pushed through the valley, the corporations buying up ranches, the pressure on small landholders to sell. It was all about water, about controlling access to the springs and underground sources that made the valley livable. And these documents, hidden for 60 years, established water rights that predated everything that came after. Rights that, if they were still valid, would belong to whoever could prove legitimate claim. Rights that would be worth millions to the people of the valley or to corporations that wanted to control them. This isn't about gold, Wade said aloud, his voice echoing in the small chamber. It was never about gold. It's about water, about survival, about keeping the valley alive. He picked up the photograph of the donkey, standing with Mitchell. The resemblance to Trotter was unmistakable. The same build, the same patient expression, the same quality of quiet knowing in the eyes. Trotter was descended from Mitchell's animals, part of the keeper's line. And somehow, across 3 or 4 generations, the knowledge had been passed down. The waypoints, the springs, the routes through dangerous country, the ability to sense what was safe and what wasn't. Wade sat in that chamber for over an hour, reading every document, understanding finally what Mitchell had been trying to do. The captain hadn't been hoarding treasure for his own benefit. He'd been trying to preserve resources that would allow the valley to remain independent, to resist control by outside forces that would drain it dry for profit, and he'd entrusted that mission to animals who would outlive him, who would carry the knowledge forward until someone was worthy of finding it. Wade thought about his own life, about the years spent working land he didn't own, watching the valley change around him, seeing small ranches fail and corporations take over. He thought about the families who'd been forced out, the old ways that had been lost, the community that had slowly been bled of its independence. This could change all of that. These documents, properly filed and authenticated, could restore water rights to the people who'd lived here for generations, could break the railroad's control, could save the valley, but it could also make him wealthy beyond imagining if he claimed it for himself. The railroad would pay a fortune for these documents. The corporations would negotiate, make deals, offer him more money than he'd ever dreamed of. Wade carefully gathered the documents and placed them back in the metal box. He added Mitchell's complete journal, wrapped everything in the oilcloth, and sealed the box as best he could. Then he put it in his pack, stood up, and made his way back out of the mine. Outside, Trotter was waiting, and Wade walked over to him. The donkey looked at him with those patient, knowing eyes, and Wade understood that this moment was a test, not of his intelligence or his strength, but of his character. "You've been trying to show me this the whole time," Wade said. "Not the gold everyone talks about, the real treasure. The thing Mitchell died trying to protect." Trotter didn't react, just stood there solid and patient. "I could keep this for myself," Wade continued, speaking aloud because he needed to hear the words. "Could sell it to the highest bidder, pay off my debts, set myself up comfortable for whatever years I have left. Nobody would blame me. I've earned it by following you this far." But even as he said it, Wade knew what he was going to do. Knew it with the same certainty he'd felt when he'd decided to follow Trotter in the first place. "Or I could do what Mitchell wanted, what you've been trying to show me all along. I could make sure these documents get filed properly, that the rights go where they belong, to the people of the valley, to families like mine who've worked this land and loved it and deserve to keep it." He thought about his daughter getting married without him, thought about Martha, who'd always believed he was a good man even when he couldn't see it himself. Thought about the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. "Your mother would have known what to do," Wade said to the memory of his daughter. "She always knew the right thing, and she tried to teach me. Maybe I'm finally learning." He looked at Trotter and made his choice. "We're taking these documents to the county seat. We're going to file them properly and make sure they get to where they need to be. And if that means I stay poor and alone, well, I've been poor and alone for a while now. At least this way I'll be poor and alone for the right reasons." Trotter's ears moved forward, and if Wade hadn't known better, he'd have sworn the donkey looked satisfied. But as Wade turned to begin the journey to the county seat, he heard the sound of horses behind him. He turned and felt his heart sink. Virgil Kane sat on his horse with 4 men flanking him, all of them carrying rifles across their saddles. They'd been watching, waiting, and now they'd found exactly what they were looking for. "Well now," Virgil said, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "Looks like you found something interesting after all. Why don't you hand over that pack, old man, and we can all part ways friendly?" Wade's hand tightened on his pack strap. The documents inside were worth more than his life, worth more than any threats these men could make. And Trotter had spent 60 years and 3 generations trying to complete this mission. "Can't do that," Wade said, his voice steady despite the fear in his gut. Virgil smiled, but it was the smile of a wolf. "Then I guess we're not parting ways friendly." The men dismounted, and Wade knew he had seconds to decide. Fight or run. Stand his ground or try to escape. At 62, with bad knees and a pack full of irreplaceable documents, his options were limited. But Trotter had other ideas. The donkey moved between Wade and the approaching men, ears back, body tense, and Wade remembered what Mitchell had written. These animals didn't just guide. They protected what they were meant to protect. "Run," Wade said to himself. "Run and trust Trotter to know the way." And he did. Wade ran, his body protesting every step, but fear gave him strength he didn't know he still possessed. Behind him, he heard shouting, the sound of men giving chase. But Trotter was already moving, leading Wade toward a narrow gap between rock formations that Wade would never have seen on his own. They squeezed through, branches tearing at Wade's clothes, his pack catching on stones. He heard a rifle shot, the bullet whining off rock somewhere to his left, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Trotter plunged ahead and Wade followed, trusting the donkey's instinct the way Mitchell had trusted 60 years before. The gap opened into a steep ravine, and Wade half ran, half slid down the loose scree, his boots finding purchase where they could, his hands grabbing at brush to slow his descent. He could hear Kane's men behind him, cursing, their heavier bodies struggling with the terrain. At the bottom, Trotter was already moving, following a path that seemed to appear just as they needed it. Wade's lungs burned. His legs felt like they might give out, but he pushed forward, driven by the weight of the pack on his back and the knowledge of what it contained. They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. Trotter leading them through passages Wade could barely perceive. The donkey moved with absolute certainty, turning left where everything looked the same, going right when Wade's instinct said straight. And gradually, the sounds of pursuit faded behind them. Wade finally collapsed against a rock face, gasping for breath, his heart hammering in his chest. His hands shook as he checked the pack, making sure the metal box was still secure. It was, thanks to how carefully he'd wrapped it. Trotter stood nearby, breathing heavily but alert, ears swiveling to catch any sound of danger. The donkey had led them into a narrow canyon Wade didn't recognize. Walls of red rock, rising steeply on either side, the sky a ribbon of blue overhead. "How did you know?" Wade asked between gasps. "How did you know that gap was there?" But he already knew the answer. The keeper's line remembered. 60 years of genetic memory, passed down from the animals that had established this route with Mitchell, carried forward through generations of descendants who'd never forgotten the paths, the hiding places, the ways through seemingly impassable terrain. Wade pulled out the metal box and opened it, checking once more that the documents were undamaged. The water rights certificates lay there, old paper that represented the future of everyone who lived in the valley. The surveyor's map with its precise markings of springs and aquifers. Mitchell's journal documenting it all, and Wade understood with sudden clarity what was at stake. This wasn't just about preserving history or proving legends true. This was about whether the valley would remain a place where families could make a living, or whether it would become just another resource to be exploited and abandoned. The railroads pushed through the valley, the pressure on ranchers to sell, the way corporations had been quietly buying up water access, it all made sense now. They knew or suspected that there were older claims, rights that predated their ownership. These documents would prove it, would establish that the water belonged to the people, not to outside interests. Wade thought about his own life, his own failures. He'd lost his wife to cancer, lost his daughter to his own stubbornness, lost his sense of purpose to years of just surviving. But here, now, with this battered metal box and a donkey that carried memories in its blood, he had a chance to do something that mattered, something that would last beyond his own life. He pulled out his notebook and wrote, "Decision point." Could sell these documents for personal gain. Enough money to live comfortable, maybe enough to try to buy back my daughter's affection. But that's not what Mitchell died for. Not what Trotter's been trying to show me. The right thing is clear, even if it's hard. Then he looked at his satellite phone. He had maybe 2 hours of battery left, enough for 1 or 2 calls. He could call the sheriff, report Kane and his men for assault and attempted theft. But that would take time. And time meant giving Kane a chance to track them down again, or he could call Miss Albright. She'd know what to do with the documents, how to file them properly, who to contact to make sure they were authenticated and recorded. She'd been preserving local history for decades. She'd understand the importance of what Wade had found. He made the call. It rang 4 times before she answered. "Miss Albright, it's Wade Connelly." "Wade." Her voice carried surprise and concern. "Where are you?" "I heard you'd gone out into the basin." "I need your help," Wade interrupted. "I found what I was looking for. Mitchell's documents. Water rights going back to before the war. They're real, they're authentic, and they're more important than I can explain right now." Silence on the other end then. "Where are you?" "Deep in the mining district. I'm heading toward the county seat, but there are men after me. Dangerous men who want these documents for themselves. Wade, you need to call the sheriff." "No time for that. Listen, I need you to contact the county registrar. Tell them I'm coming with historical documents that need immediate filing and authentication." And I need you to gather some witnesses, people from the valley who will understand what this means. People who can't be bought by the railroad." He could hear her breathing, hear the weight of what he was asking settling on her. "Then, I'll do it. How long until you reach town?" Wade looked at Trotter, at the sun's position in the sky, calculated distances he barely understood. "Tomorrow, if we travel through the night. Maybe the day after if we have to hide from Kane's men." "Kane?" Miss Albright's voice sharpened. "Virgil Kane? Wade, he's dangerous, I know. But these documents are more important than my safety. If something happens to me, you need to know where to find them. I'll mark the route in my notebook, leave copies of everything I can. Someone has to complete this. Nothing's going to happen to you," Miss Albright said firmly. "You get here, Wade. You get here and we'll make sure these documents are filed properly, and Kane can't do a damn thing about it." Wade smiled at the uncharacteristic profanity. "Yes, ma'am. And Wade?" Her voice softened. "Your daughter called me last week. Asked if I'd heard from you. Said she was worried. You might want to let her know you're all right." Wade's throat tightened. "She called you?" "She did. Still cares about you, even if she's not sure how to show it. You've got more than one reason to make it back safe." After they hung up, Wade sat for a long time, staring at his phone. His daughter had been worried, had reached out in her way, trying to find him. Maybe not ready to rebuild their relationship, but not completely closed to it either. He thought about calling her, but his battery was low and he needed to conserve it for emergencies. Instead, he pulled out paper and pen from his notebook and began writing. "Dear Katie," he wrote, using the name he'd called her when she was small, before she'd become Catherine with a career and a life far from the valley. "I'm writing this in case I don't make it back. There are men after me because I found something valuable, and I need you to know some things I should have said a long time ago. I was a lousy father. I let work and pride and stubbornness keep me from being the parent you deserved. Your mother tried to tell me, tried to show me what I was missing, but I didn't listen until it was too late. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all the times I chose the wrong thing over you. I found something out here, not treasure the way most people think of it, but something that could help a lot of families keep their homes and their way of life. I'm going to make sure it gets to where it needs to go, even if it costs me. I wanted you to know that, at the end, I finally chose something bigger than myself. I love you. I always have, even when I didn't know how to show it. And I'm proud of you, of the person you've become despite having me for a father. I hope your husband treats you the way you deserve, and I hope you're happy. If you ever have children, tell them about their grandfather. Not just the mistakes I made, but that at the end, I tried to do the right thing. Maybe that'll count for something. Love always, Dad." He folded the letter and put it in his pack along with his notebook, all the documentation of his journey with Trotter. If something happened to him, Miss Albright would find these things, would make sure his daughter received the letter. The sun was lowering toward the western ridge, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and gold. Wade checked his supplies, enough water for 2 days if he was careful, enough food for one. The journey to the county seat was 40 miles of hard country, and they'd have to avoid the main routes where Kane's men might be watching. But Trotter would know the way. The keeper's line always knew. Wade stood and shouldered his pack, feeling the weight of it settle across his shoulders. His body ached, his knees protested, but his mind was clear. He knew what he had to do, knew why it mattered, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "All right," he said to Trotter. "Show me the way. Get us there safe, and I'll make sure Mitchell's mission is completed. I'll make sure these documents get filed and the valley is protected." Trotter looked at him with those patient, knowing eyes, then turned and began walking. Not fast, but purposeful, following paths only he could sense, guided by memory that reached back through generations, to the moment Captain Mitchell had first established this route. They walked through the evening and into the night, the moon rising full and bright enough to light their way. Wade's feet found rhythm, his breathing steadied, and he let his mind settle into the peace that comes from knowing you're doing the right thing, regardless of the cost. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, Kane and his men were searching. Ahead, the county seat waited with its registry office and its witnesses and the machinery of law that would protect what Mitchell had hidden. And between them, an old man and a donkey moved through the ancient landscape, carrying forward a mission 60 years in the making, guided by memory that flowed through blood and instinct and the unbreakable bond between creatures who understood that some things were worth more than gold. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, but Wade felt the weight of their witness. He was part of something larger now, part of a story that had begun before he was born and would continue after he was gone. And in that moment, with Trotter walking steadily beside him and the documents secure in his pack, Wade Connelly finally understood what legacy really meant. Dawn came with no mercy, just pale light that showed how much ground they still had to cover. Wade's legs had gone past aching into a kind of numb acceptance, each step automatic, his body running on will alone. They'd walked through the entire night, stopping only twice to let Trotter drink from springs the donkey found without hesitation. The county seat lay somewhere ahead, maybe 10 miles, maybe 15. Wade had lost his ability to judge distance accurately. Everything blurred together. Rock formations, scattered trees, the endless roll of terrain that looked the same in every direction. He pulled out his father's pocket watch, the one he'd carried since the old man died 30 years ago. 6:15 in the morning. They'd been moving for over 12 hours straight. Wade clicked the watch closed and felt its weight in his palm. Solid, real, a connection to a time when things seemed simpler. Behind them, carried on the morning breeze, came the sound of horses. Wade's exhaustion fell away, replaced by a spike of adrenaline that made his hands shake. He turned and saw them, 3 riders maybe a mile back, moving at a steady pace that would close the distance within an hour. "They found us," Wade said to Trotter. "Or they guessed where we were heading and circled around." Trotter's ears went back, and the donkey picked up his pace. Not running, Trotter never seemed to run, but moving faster, more purposefully, choosing a path that angled toward a line of cottonwood trees in the distance. Water. There had to be water where cottonwoods grew. Wade followed, forcing his protesting body to keep pace. The riders were gaining, their horses fresh, while Wade was running on fumes. But Trotter had an advantage. He knew this country in ways no rider could match, knew every game trail and hidden passage, every place where the land itself could be used for cover or concealment. They reached the cottonwoods and found what Wade had hoped for, a river, swollen with spring runoff, moving fast and cold between banks lined with rocks and tangled roots. The water was high, probably 20 yards across, deep enough in the center that Wade couldn't see the bottom. Trotter didn't hesitate. He stepped into the water at a specific point, moving with that same confident purpose, and Wade followed. The current grabbed at his legs immediately, strong enough to make him stagger. The cold took his breath, water soaking through his boots and jeans. But Trotter knew the ford, knew where the bottom was solid and where it dropped away. The donkey picked a diagonal path across, fighting the current but never losing his footing, and Wade stayed close behind, one hand on Trotter's pack harness, letting the animal guide him through water that would have swept him away if he'd tried to cross alone. They made it to the far bank and climbed out, both of them dripping and cold, but safe. Wade looked back and saw the riders reaching the near bank. One of them urged his horse into the water at a different spot, the obvious crossing where the river looked shallowest. The horse went in chest-deep immediately, the current catching it broadside. The rider fought to control his mount, pulling hard on the reins, and the horse managed to lunge back to shore, but the attempt had cost them precious minutes. The riders regrouped, argued. Wade could see their gestures, even if he couldn't hear their words, and finally began searching for the ford Trotter had used. By the time they found it, Wade and Trotter had disappeared into a maze of rocky outcroppings on the far side of the river. They moved through country that grew increasingly familiar. Wade had ranched in this area 40 years ago, knew some of these formations, recognized landmarks he'd forgotten he remembered. His knowledge and Trotter's instinct combined into something greater than either alone. The sun climbed higher, and Wade's exhaustion returned with crushing force. His vision narrowed, his breathing came in ragged gasps, and twice he stumbled and nearly fell. Only Trotter's solid presence kept him moving. The donkey would stop when Wade faltered, wait with patient concern until Wade could continue. "Can't stop," Wade muttered to himself. To Trotter, to the mission that had consumed his life for the past 2 weeks. Too close now. Too close to quit. He checked his father's watch again. 9:30. They'd put distance between themselves and the riders, but not enough. Not nearly enough. The terrain opened up ahead and Wade felt his heart lift. There in the distance he could see buildings. The county seat, small, dusty, but real and solid, and representing everything he'd been trying to reach. Civilization, law, protection. "We made it," Wade said, and his voice cracked with relief and exhaustion. "Trotter, we made it." But even as the words left his mouth, he saw them. More riders, coming from the direction of town, blocking the main road. 4 of them, and even from a distance, Wade recognized the lead horse. Virgil Kane had guessed their destination, had split his forces, and now had them trapped between 2 groups with nowhere left to run. Wade's hand went to his pack, to the metal box that held everything. He was so close. The town was right there, less than 2 miles. But Kane's men were positioned perfectly, and Wade had nothing left to give. His body was done. His reserves were empty. He looked at Trotter, and the donkey looked back at him with those patient, knowing eyes. They'd come so far, overcome so much, and now they were stopped within sight of their goal by men who understood nothing about what they were really fighting for. Wade pulled out his father's watch one more time. 9:45. He wound it carefully, listening to the familiar tick, and made a decision. If they couldn't get through, he'd have to find another way. One that didn't involve running anymore, because running was no longer possible. "All right," he said quietly to Trotter. "Let's finish this." Wade walked toward the waiting riders with Trotter at his side, his pace deliberate, his head high despite the exhaustion that pulled at every muscle. If this was ending, it would end on his terms, not with him running like prey. Kane dismounted when Wade was 50 feet away, his men forming a semicircle that cut off any escape route. Up close, Kane looked tired too. Days of searching had taken their toll. But his eyes were hard, and his hand rested on the rifle holstered at his saddle. "End of the line, old man," Kane said. "Give me the pack and we can all go home." Wade stopped, one hand on Trotter's neck. "Can't do that. You've got no choice. Look around. You're outnumbered, exhausted, and we both know you're not walking away from 7 armed men. Be smart for once in your stubborn life." "Smart would be understanding what these documents really are," Wade said, his voice carrying despite his weariness. "But you just see dollar signs. You don't see what they mean to the people who live here." "I see survival," Kane shot back. "I see my way out of debt. I see a future that doesn't involve begging for work or selling off everything I own, piece by piece." His voice turned bitter. "You think you're the only one who's struggled? The only one who's watched this valley change while you got left behind?" Wade heard the truth in it, heard the desperation that matched his own. "These documents aren't the answer to that. They're meant for the whole community. The community that doesn't give a damn about us," Kane interrupted. "The community that's been bought out piece by the railroad while the old families watch and do nothing. You want to give them salvation. I want to save myself." Before Wade could respond, Trotter moved. The donkey stepped between Wade and Kane, ears flat back, body tense in a way Wade had never seen before. It wasn't aggression exactly. It was protection, pure and absolute. The behavior of an animal defending something precious. Kane's hand went to his rifle, and Wade's heart stopped. "Don't," he said quickly. "He's just protecting me. He won't hurt anyone if you don't threaten us." "Then tell him to move." "I can't. He's part of this mission, has been for 60 years through 3 generations. He won't let you take these documents." Kane's expression darkened, and Wade braced for violence. But then one of Kane's men spoke up, his voice uncertain. "Virgil, there's people coming from town." They all turned. A group was approaching on foot, a dozen people, maybe more, led by a figure Wade recognized even at a distance. Miss Albright, moving with surprising speed for a woman in her 70s, and behind her came faces Wade knew. Mrs. Chen, from the general store. Jimmy from the feed store, Thompson from the bank, of the ranchers, of the families who'd lived in the valley for generations, and walking alongside Miss Albright, wearing a badge that caught the morning sun, was Sheriff Dawson. Kane cursed under his breath, but stood his ground as the group approached. Miss Albright reached them first, slightly out of breath, but with eyes that missed nothing. "Wade Connelly," she said. "You look like you've been through hell." "Close enough," Wade replied, and felt something in his chest unclench at the sight of friendly faces. Sheriff Dawson stepped forward, his attention on Kane. "Virgil, heard you've been chasing Wade here across half the basin. Want to tell me why?" "He's got something that belongs on public land," Kane said quickly. "Historical artifacts. Should be in a museum, not in some old rancher's pack." "That's so?" Dawson looked at Wade. "What have you got there, Wade?" Wade carefully removed the metal box from his pack and opened it. He pulled out the land deed first, the original, with its official seals and signatures still visible despite its age. "Water rights," Wade said simply. "Established 1861, covering springs and aquifers throughout the valley. Captain James Mitchell hid them during the war to keep them from being seized. I found them with Trotter's help." He held up the deed, and Miss Albright took it with careful hands, her eyes scanning the document. Her expression changed as she read, understanding dawning. "This is authentic," she said quietly. "Wade, do you understand what this means?" "I do. It means the water in this valley doesn't belong to the railroad. It belongs to whoever holds these rights, and these rights predate every claim that came after." A murmur went through the assembled townspeople. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, looked at the deed, then at Wade. "The railroad's been pressuring my cousin to sell his land. Said they owned the water access, and without it his ranch would dry up. This changes that? If it's properly filed and authenticated," Miss Albright said, "this establishes water rights that supersede everything else. The community could claim these collectively. Form a water cooperative that protects everyone's access." Kane's face had gone pale. "That's worth millions." "You can't just give it away." "I can and I am," Wade interrupted. "This isn't about money. It's about protecting this valley and the people in it." He pulled out Mitchell's journal. "Captain Mitchell died trying to preserve these rights for future generations. He trusted his mission to animals who would remember when humans forgot. This donkey," he put his hand on Trotter's neck, "is descended from Mitchell's line of keepers. He's been guiding me to this moment for weeks." Sheriff Dawson took the journal, read several passages aloud. The crowd grew quiet, listening to Mitchell's words from 60 years ago, understanding the weight of what had been hidden and found. When Dawson finished reading, he looked at Kane. "Sounds to me like Wade's got legitimate claim to these documents through discovery and the tradition Mitchell established. And it sounds like he's choosing to transfer them to community ownership." He paused. "Also sounds like you've been threatening him, which is assault. Your men want to confirm that?" Kane's men shifted uncomfortably, and one by one they stepped away from their employer. They'd signed on to search for treasure, not to assault an old man trying to do the right thing. Kane stood alone, defeated, and Wade felt no triumph, just exhaustion and relief. "Let's get these documents filed," Sheriff Dawson said. "Wade, you up for walking to the registry office?" Wade looked at Trotter, at the townspeople who'd come to witness this moment, at Miss Albright holding the deed that would change everything. "I am," he said. They walked together into town, Wade and Trotter at the center of a procession that grew as word spread. By the time they reached the registry office, half the town had gathered to watch as Wade Connelly formally transferred water rights worth millions to the Valley Cooperative, asking nothing in return except that Trotter be remembered as the keeper who'd made it all possible. 3 months had changed the valley in ways both visible and invisible. The water cooperative had been formally established, papers filed and authenticated by experts who'd traveled from 3 states to examine Mitchell's documents. The railroad had been forced to renegotiate access rights they'd assumed were theirs by default. 7 ranching families who'd been preparing to sell out had found new hope in guaranteed water access that couldn't be taken away by corporate pressure. And Wade Connelly, who'd started this journey with $2.37 in his wallet, had enough money now to live comfortably, not wealthy, but secure. The cooperative had insisted on paying him a finder's fee, modest by the standards of what he'd discovered, substantial by the standards of a man who'd been counting pennies. His debts were paid. His electricity stayed on. His pantry stayed stocked. But more than that, he had purpose. On a clear morning in October, Wade drove his truck, running reliably now with new spark plugs and fresh oil, out to the spring where Trotter had first led him. He had something in the truck bed wrapped in canvas, something he'd been working on in his barn for the past month. Trotter rode in the passenger seat, looking out the window with his usual patient expression. The donkey had become something of a local celebrity. Children asked to pet him when Wade came to town. The Historical Society had commissioned a painting. The local newspaper had run a story about the keeper's line that had captivated readers across the region. But to Wade, Trotter was simply Trotter, the companion who'd shown him what really mattered. The guide who'd led him not just to hidden documents, but to a better version of himself. They reached the spring, and Wade parked near the red rock formations that had looked so ordinary before he understood their significance. He lifted the wrapped object from the truck bed and carried it to a flat spot near the water's edge. The sign he'd carved was simple wood. The letters burned in with careful precision. Trotter's Rest. Below that, in smaller script, here the journey began. Here the keeper showed the way. Wade dug post holes with an energy he hadn't felt in years, set the sign firmly in the ground, and stepped back to admire his work. It wasn't fancy, but it would last. People would see it, and remember that sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't the ones you can hold in your hand. He sat on a rock near the spring, Trotter standing beside him, and thought about everything that had happened. The documents were filed. The valley was protected. Kane had pleaded guilty to assault and was serving time. Miss Albright was writing a book about the whole affair, with Wade's permission to include entries from his notebook, and Wade's daughter had actually called, not just sent a letter. Her voice had been tentative, uncertain, but there. She'd read the letter he'd written, the one Miss Albright had forwarded after the registry office scene. She'd read about his journey, about what he'd learned, about his apology for being a poor father. "I'd like to come visit," she'd said, "if that's okay." "If you want me to." He'd had to clear his throat before he could answer. "I'd like that very much." The sound of a car on the dirt road pulled Wade from his memories. He stood, heart suddenly pounding, and watched a rental car navigate the rough terrain. It pulled up behind his truck, and when the door opened, his daughter stepped out. Katie, not Catherine. Katie, like he'd called her when she was small. She looked so much like Martha it hurt. The same eyes, the same way of standing with one hand shading her face from the sun. But there were differences too, marks of her own life, her own experiences. She was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, not the business clothes he'd imagined. Practical boots, ready for the country. They stood looking at each other for a long moment, and Wade felt all the words he'd prepared dissolve into silence. Then she smiled, tentative but real, and walked toward him. "Hi, Dad." "Katie." His voice cracked on her name. "You came." I said I would. She reached him, and they stood awkwardly, neither quite sure whether to hug or shake hands, or just stand there. Finally, she stepped forward and put her arms around him. And Wade held his daughter for the first time in 2 years, when they stepped apart. Both of them were wiping their eyes and trying to pretend they weren't. "This is Trotter," Wade said, gesturing to the donkey. "The one I told you about." Katie approached carefully and held out her hand. Trotter sniffed it, then allowed her to stroke his neck. "He's beautiful," she said. "And you really believe he knew where to find those documents?" "I don't believe it," Wade replied. "I know it. I watched him guide me to places I never would have found on my own. He's part of something bigger than either of us, a line that goes back generations, carrying knowledge in ways we don't fully understand." They spent an hour at the spring, Wade telling her everything. Not just the facts of the discovery, but what it had meant to him. How following Trotter had taught him to pay attention, to trust, to choose what mattered over what was easy. "I spent so many years working toward a future that never came," Wade said. "Always telling myself that once I had enough money, once things were stable, then I'd have time for what really mattered. But life doesn't wait for us to be ready. Your mother tried to tell me that." Katie nodded slowly. "She did. She used to say you were always building a bridge to somewhere you never actually wanted to go." She was right. Wade looked at his daughter. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. Sorry I missed so much. Sorry I let pride and stubbornness keep me from being the father you deserved." "I'm sorry, too," Katie said quietly. "Sorry I gave up on you. Sorry I didn't try harder to understand what you were going through after Mom died." They sat in silence for a while, just being present together, not trying to fix everything at once, but acknowledging that healing takes time. Finally, Katie said, "I'd like to meet your friends, the people who helped you with all this. Miss Albright sounds wonderful from your stories." "She is. They all are." Wade stood, offered his hand to help her up. "And I'd like you to see my cabin. It's not much, but it's home. Maybe we could make dinner together, the way we used to on Sundays?" Katie smiled, and Wade saw Martha in that smile, saw forgiveness and possibility and second chances. "I'd like that." They drove back together, Wade's truck leading the way with Trotter in the passenger seat, Katie following in her rental car. The valley spread out around them, protected now, its water rights secured for generations to come. Children growing up here would have a chance at the life Wade had known in his youth, before corporations and progress had threatened to drain the land dry. That evening, in Wade's small cabin, father and daughter cooked a simple meal. They talked about her wedding. He'd missed it, but she shared photos on her phone. They talked about her husband, about her work, about the life she'd built far from the valley. And Wade listened in ways he'd never listened before, really hearing her instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. Trotter stood in the yard as the sun set, peaceful and content, his mission finally complete after 60 years and 4 generations of waiting. The keeper's line had fulfilled its purpose, had guided a man who needed guiding to something more valuable than gold. Wade looked out the window at the donkey and felt gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He'd started this journey broke and alone, accepting a useless animal as payment because he'd had no choice. He'd ended it wealthy in the ways that actually mattered, reconnected with his daughter, respected by his community, and finally understanding what his wife had tried to teach him all along. The greatest treasures weren't found in the ground. They were found in purpose and connection, in doing the right thing when it cost you everything, in paying attention to what was right in front of you instead of always chasing what lay beyond the next ridge. Outside, Trotter raised his head to the darkening sky, and Wade raised a glass to him, to the faithful beast who'd known all along what Wade had needed to learn. Some journeys end where they began, but the traveler returns transformed. Wade Connelly had started out empty and desperate. He'd come home whole and hopeful, carrying not gold, but something far more precious, the knowledge that there's always time for second chances if you're brave enough to take them.